Hello, I am Lynn Fritz, licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm a Karuk tribal descendant, expert witness for Indian child welfare, and am in Redding, California. Joan, can you introduce yourself?
I sure can. I'm Joan Borysenko, PhD, and I'm both a licensed clinical psychologist, and I'm also a cell biologist. In fact, I have a doctorate from Harvard Medical School in cellular biology, and it's the mind-body connection that has fascinated me already, Lynn, for 50 years. So I'm excited for our conversation.
Because the spirituality is still somewhat controversial in the field of psychotherapy, many clinicians struggle with it. Could you define what you mean by spirituality and what it has to do with with trauma?
I sure can. And excuse me. I have to first of all say that the best definition of spirituality that I have ever heard was given by a Harvard psychiatrist, Dr. George Vaillant, and that's spelled Vaillant. And Dr. Vaillant has been really researching what is it that makes us successful as human beings? What is it that brings forth the sense of being fully human and balanced, both in career and personal life and body? And he's renowned for that work. His definition of spirituality is fascinating, and I support it wholeheartedly because it's a definition that has nothing to do with theology, with sacred texts, with anything like that. It's really a definition based on deep connection. When we feel a deep connection with ourselves, with other people, with nature, with kind of the wholeness of life at all different levels, what happens is that a constellation of 8 positive emotions arises. And for example, one of them is awe. And there's a lot of research interest in the state of awe these days. Another one, other than awe, is compassion. Also, there's a tremendous research interest in compassion toward others and in self-compassion. Then there's love, gratefulness, forgiveness, joy, hope. Goodness, I'm forgetting the last one. But they're a little bit like classically the fruits of the Spirit. And the idea is when you take the stress off of the system, and I would say neurologically what happens when you begin to calm down activity in the default mode network of the brain, that constellation of 8 positive emotions simply arises. So you could think of it as that's our unflustered state. That's our birthright state. And the question always is, how do we decrease activity in the default mode network of the brain? And that network is really a central hub. And one of its very important functions is that it mediates between the executive cortical functions and what's going on in the amygdala and the hippocampus. And of course, all of that goes awry when an individual has been traumatized. There's a disruption of those networks and the network of salience. And so all of a sudden we think, oh my goodness, terrible things are going to happen. The amygdala is activated. And these are the things that prevent that constellation of spiritual or positive emotions from arising. So it's pretty fascinating to see what calms down the default mode network, because that's also going to help relieve some of the symptomatology of fear and trauma time, not really being able to move into the future because we're arrested in the past. And I'll try to make this simple now. One of the best ways to decrease activity in the default mode network turns out to be meditation, self-regulation, ways that we calm down that circuitry, and that relieves us so much of worry, of rumination, and of some of the effects of trauma in terms of seeing so many cues as possibly frightening.
When trauma occurs, how, in a nutshell, the brain forms what would we call perhaps a narrative. Is it possible to change that narrative?
That's the big question, isn't it, Lynn? And as you know, I've been fascinated with narrative therapy, narrative medicine for a very long time. And for example, there's actually a program at a master's degree at Columbia University in narrative medicine, just looking at how when we have a problem, if we're ill or traumatized, of course we have a narrative that goes along with that. And then what happens, one of the roles of the default mode network is, okay, let me give you an example. Here's a narrative. My parents died in a car crash, God forbid, when I was 4 years old. And since that time, I went into foster care. I had terrible experiences there. I don't trust anybody. And that's my story. That's my trauma story. And then what happens over time, of course, is that you have different experiences. Maybe you go into a work setting, there's a new boss, there's different colleagues. And if you're traumatized and that old story is what's dominating your brain, what happens is that you misinterpret cues. And let's say someone doesn't say good morning to you. Perhaps instead of saying, they were in a rush, your old trauma story comes up and you create a new story. That person doesn't like me. I'm a worthless worm. Nobody likes me. I'm going to fail at this job too. I'm going to get myself fired. So new stories graft on to the old trauma stories. And that there's part of the default mode network, in fact, that creates narrative, and that's the posterior cingulate cortex. And once again, we come to how can we change the actual narrative? Well, one way is to create a little bit more mental space. That's what's interesting about mindfulness training, because instead of just jumping into the story, what mindfulness helps people do is to develop a little bit of distance between the thinking brain and like what's going on in my body or what's going on in my mind, so that it would be possible at some point to say, aha, I've done it again. I've jumped right into my trauma story. Maybe I could take a couple of deep breaths and back off and consider other possibilities for why that person didn't say good morning. And that's very, very useful. But another way of changing narrative is to change meaning. And of course, we're creatures of meaning. That's what human beings do. We're trying to create some kind of reality in which we feel safe. So that's how we create meaning, is that attempt to create safety that we don't have when we're traumatized. That's what we need to do, is to provide ourselves with a bigger overview of who we are, of what is important in life, of beginning to see things in a more resilient nature, and to take a look preferentially at what are the strengths we have, what are the strengths we can develop. And that pulls us out of some of the old stories of pain and victimization. And it does change neural circuits. There's hope.
There definitely is hope. I guess what this makes me think of is conversations and people pointing to the neuroplasticity of the brain. So I guess the question I would follow up with is, what is your favorite tool for self-directed neuroplasticity?
Don't you love that word, Lynn? I love it.
Yeah.
Self-directed neuroplasticity, because the brain is always changing. But the question here is, can we do something to push it in the right direction, to develop neural pathways that will start to kick in automatically so that the brain doesn't go down the old pathways that have been reinforced over and over and over again, particularly in trauma? So I can tell you my two heroes in the field of neuroplasticity who have really taught me a great deal. And the first one is Rick Hansen. And I think Rick is so very well known for his work on self-directed neuroplasticity and resilience. Let me give you his idea, and then this will lead into my previous teacher. So what Rick talks about is this, that we have a built-in negativity bias because those of us who learned to be hypervigilant and scan for bad stuff survived longer, and we got to pass on our genes. And so we're much more hardwired to see the negative rather than to look for the positive. So how do you reverse that? My goodness, it's an inborn thing through generations and generations and generations of evolution. Well, what Rick points out is this: little good things happen all the time. So, for example, I was out this morning stressing myself over the fact that there'd been a big snowstorm, that my husband has recently had a total knee replacement, that there wasn't enough parking space for some people who were coming this morning, that I had this to do, that all of this, and believe me, my negativity circuits were getting up there. And when that happens, we don't think so clearly. And so here's what happened. I thought, can I focus on something good? And the beauty of the sparkling snow in the sun was right there. Mm-hmm. And I thought, oh gosh, let me savor this for a little bit. And I took a few deep breaths and really brought all my senses online to watch the beautiful blue sun, red mountains, white sparkling snow, and it was gorgeous. And I hung with that for probably 20 seconds, just breathing and savoring. And by that time, my nervous system had calmed down a great deal. Now, good things like sparkly snow happen many times throughout the day. Something wonderful comes up. And again, we tend to go right past it because of the negativity bias. But if you're on the lookout for the good, And then when something good crosses your path, you stop for 10 to 20 seconds, bring your senses online. What happens is that you start to create new neural circuits, which help you to become more attentive to the good, more present, more mindful of the moment. And this is so very important because when we're traumatized, one of the problems of trauma is it's harder to be present because we're stuck in past time. Very hard to bring ourselves to the now. And so this is a wonderful exercise. It only takes 10 or 20 seconds. Now, let me link that to my first teaching in this, way before any of the neuroscience had shown that you could change your brain. Let's go back in time, maybe 30 years. Well, 30 years ago, I heard a lecture by a man whose name is Brother David Steindl Rast. And he had written a book called Gratefulness. And he defines gratefulness as the great fullness, because you feel so full and so content when gratitude fills you up. So I like that, the great fullness. And he had been a teacher of mindfulness for many years. He'd been a Zen meditation teacher. So he gave the audience this piece of advice, which I have followed almost daily for 30 years and has definitely changed my brain. Before you go to bed at night, according to Brother David, think back over your day to one moment of goodness, something that it's not something like, oh, I'm thankful for my partner who loves me, or for having enough food, or all those things are wonderful, but it's something specific that day that caught your attention. This morning, I talked about seeing the sparkling snow. And so tonight, before I go to bed, what he says is find a moment like that and rerun it for about a minute and all the detail that you can. And so unless something else comes along, that's what I'll do as I'm going to sleep tonight. Much better than going to bed rerunning your anxieties or fretting over your to-do list. You think of this thing that really made you feel full. And the side benefit of that is if you know you're going to do this simple practice and you hold yourself responsible, you start to search for stuff during the day that you could rerun that night. And so you start to become more attentive to all of these little moments of goodness and beauty and start to fill yourself more with them during the day. So for me, the combination of Brother David and Rick Hansen, that's my favorite way to enhance self-directed neuroplasticity, and as Rick says, to install the good.
Powerful. This must be that aspect that deals with that body-mind regulation with trauma.
Well, absolutely, because what happens when we're traumatized is this. We all want to be safe. That's the most basic human thing. We want to be safe and we want to be connected. And the first aspect, most important aspect neurologically in terms of what connects us, is the affiliation system. It's being able to look to others to find that sense of love and connection. And of course, if trauma has affected our attachment system and that's gone awry, it's hard to find a sense of safety. And what happens then is it's really easy to trigger the fight or flight response. and to start to feel out of control. And of course, if you really get terrified, you go out of fight or flight into the freeze response, a dissociative response. And I think, by the way, that the work of Stephen Porges on polyvagal theory makes this whole hierarchy of what goes on in the body so understandable. And also, I think it's very helpful to people who, for example, have frozen during a robbery. That wasn't volitional. That was your nervous system trying to keep you safe. That's what happens when terror really overtakes you, is that kind of vasovagal response. But in any case, we're looking for ways that we can intervene in this system. And we can intervene in the fight or flight response by learning a variety of different techniques. Number one, that can enhance vagal tone. That's really important. Different kinds of meditation, yoga, things like that. Breathing techniques. There are so many wonderful breathing techniques, or techniques of resourcing ourselves. And so these kinds of self-regulation techniques are really very, very important and, reasonably easy to learn. And then, of course, I think neurofeedback techniques are really very, very important in engaging these different networks and engaging the vagus nerve in a way that calms the system of the body down and then allows us more mental space to make choices that enhance our sense of connectedness and safety.
And I think of therapists, we listen to trauma stories on a regular basis, daily. And I think one of the questions that comes up in our profession is, how do we decrease our own risk of developing compassion fatigue through secondary trauma, through hearing all these stories?
That is such a great question, Lynn, because it happens. At one point, I was consulting for the Army that has both an East and West Coast compassion fatigue unit, because the therapists who are working with vets hear so many trauma stories that they burn out. And compassion fatigue is a form of burnout. So loving kindness meditation. I think many therapists are now interested in compassion, all the studies that look at compassion. But if you can generate a sense of compassion for other people with very simple statements like, may you be at peace, may your heart be open, may you find your inner strength. There are lots of different ways to do this. But if you can generate these feelings in yourself, may I be at peace, may my heart be open, and then send them mentally to the person who's suffering, guess what? Instead of the pain centers lighting up, the reward centers of your brain light up. Like, wow, that's an amazing difference. So these are techniques that are very easily accessed, that one can learn how to do, that make it a big difference, so that we just don't end up sponges for other people's pain, but instead become transformers of that pain in our own nervous system, and then hopefully for them as well.
Yeah, that role that mind-body connection plays in mental health is so significant.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I started in this field 50 years ago, people would scratch their heads and say, mind, body, what on earth do they have to do with each other? And now I understand there's just one body mind. They're not separable.
Yes. Thank you so much.